welcome. My name is Sarah Rubin. I'm facilitating. So I'm very excited to hand this off to Tim Robards. Tim, you want to introduce yourself and just tell me to click and I'll advance the slides.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, Tim Robards with California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me. Department of Conservation, CAL FIRE, before it was CAL FIRE, and it was a small division, actually used to be part of the Department of Conservation back in the day. Could we have the next slide, please? So I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that California is facing, and then some of the programs that we have in CAL FIRE that might be relevant to this particular audience. We have a number of programs that in the wildland urban interface and for small landowners and for restoration and reforestation, but I'll focus on some of our programs that might be most of interest to this audience when I get to that point. Next slide, please. So this is a picture from Fresno County in Southern California a few years ago, and what we've had is a number of challenges of tree mortality. We had Southern California mountains south of the Tehachapi's. About 20 years ago, we had a very large mortality event. And then in Southern California, I mean in the Southern Sierras in the last decade, which is, I'll show you on the next slide, kind of a progression of that. But what's causing this is basically overstocked stands. There's too many trees for the carrying capacity, particularly with the climate that we're entering into with droughts. And part of that is fire exclusion, having had low intensity fires that we used to have excluded from the landscape. And so we have more smaller trees and less large, and we don't have the large fire resilient trees as much on the landscape. And when you have a lot of trees, the trees are really like straws sticking in the ground, and they really pull up a lot of moisture. And then when you have drought, that's a limiting factor for them, and you end up with mortality, and you end up with associated beetle outbreaks, etc. So next slide, please. This is a bit of a progression from 2014 to 2017, showing the Sierras. You can see the darker red colors, how that mortality, tree mortality, was progressing in Southern California, and it ended up stopping a little bit around the south of the Lake Tahoe area. Unfortunately now, and we had over 150 million trees that died in that event. But now with the lingering drought, we have additional bark beetle infestations that are occurring again now, and we're seeing that a lot of the foresters are reporting those up into the central and northern Sierras at this point, which is probably indicative of another wave of mortality events that are coming. This will be in a little bit of a different species mix, because as you move north in latitude, you have some different, more mixed conifer species and more of the shade tolerant white firs. Next slide, please. So then we have the challenge of the wildfire trends. And so, you know, during recent fire seasons, we've kind of witnessed a revision of the firefighter narrative. So countless what we call old timers, and I'm a really old timer because we're talking about people who are 50 years old or more who started firefighting out of high school, a lot of them. And they would tell stories about the loss or they would tell stories about having career fires. And we're kind of losing that term, because for them, that was maybe once in your career, maybe twice, you would have a very large fire that was kind of very, you know, memorable, and tell lots of stories about the fire behavior that you would see, etc. But now we're having multiple, what we used to call career fires in a season. And so that's a scary anecdotal type of story that adds to the statistics, which if we look at the next slide, we'll start talking about that. This is destructive wildfires. It's an interesting pie chart graphic, and it goes through the end of the last calendar year. And destructive here is defined as the number of structures that have been destroyed. And so if you look at the darker colors, if you start at the top and you move your way clockwise from 1932 through 1999, you can see the amount that was that's allocated into destructive fires, and there's 2 large fire events in there. If we look at the first decade of this century, those are the bluer colors, and you can see the fires there. And individual fires are named, but it's probably difficult for you to read, but that's not the important part. The important part is the trend. Then the next section is the orange, shades of orange, which are 2010 through 2019, and you can see they take up much more than half of the chart. And then just the last 2 years, 2020 through 2021, take up roughly as much as 1932 to 2009. So that's one way to look at it as far as destructive fires. Next slide, please. Now this slide is looking at acres, and so it's a similar sort of thing. You can see acres of fires, 32 through 99. The blue is the 2000 through 2009. A little bit different here in looking at acres is that this pie chart gets really crunched over from just the last 2 years. 2020 through 2021 is more than half of the acres. And so next slide, please. What this translates to is when we're looking at budgets, this is the last decade of state budgets. This does not include the federal budgets that have been expended, but they're in a similar sort of trend. And the blue is the total wildfire protection budget, and the red is emergency fund. And so what we have obviously is an issue here where we need to invest in wildfire protection and prevention to eventually reduce the protection costs. And so offsetting the cost of wood waste disposal is key to this. And an analogous, if we put greenhouse gas emissions on here, we would see a very similar thing. And wildfires can undo the effects or the efforts that California is putting into getting to a low carbon economy. Next slide, please. The final challenge I will put up here is just, this is from both a management and a wood fiber sourcing perspective, is that of land ownership. So we have about 57% of the forest lands are public lands. They tend to be higher in elevation. They were the lands a lot of times that were left over after initial settlement by Europeans. Private industrial timberlands are in larger blocks, and then we have private non-industrial, and that's about a 50-50 split in acreage between the two. Of course, those are much smaller parcels. We still have some checkerboarding left over from the 19th century. That's when railroads were put through, and the federal government encouraged railroad production by giving away land in checkerboard patterns. Those are on 640-acre sections. And so that then mixes in both private and public lands in those patterns. A lot of that's up around Mount Shasta area in California. Next slide, please. Now let's talk about some solutions. One thing we're doing is ramping up both the department's treatments, and that's encapsulated with, well, we have grant funding as well, where we're encouraging others to do treatments. We have increased numbers of fuels crews and numbers, prescribed fire training. We have a target for 2025 of 1 million acres treated annually. And that's a 50-50 split between state and federal response areas or responsibility areas. These field treatments produce and will produce significantly more as we move towards that target. Currently, what is currently non-merchantable woody biomass. And this solution here creates problems of dealing with the wood waste and funding treatments. And so the more value that can be added to this material, the less the treatments will cost. Next slide, please. So some solutions that we have here are that CAL FIRE has, we have a wood products and bioenergy team of 3 persons. We've been partnering with the U.S. Forest Service and other state agencies, and we've been funding some R&D types of studies. Some example of R&D types of studies are, we have a transportation study going on where we're looking at ways to move wood waste around with rail and port facilities. We're also doing a study looking at these wildfire impacts, or these, of these large fires to long-term wood supply, not just the salvage post-fire, but also the other wood that's still green. Next slide, please. Finally, we opened a grant at Cal Fires that's business and workforce development, and it's a continuous solicitation. Initial budget of $24 million. It's evaluated on a quarterly basis, and so we just got our first round, and we're starting to dig into to the proposals from the initial proposals that we got. You can find more information on that on the Cal Fire Grants webpage. And that's it. That's all I have. Next slide just says thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I couldn't get off mute for a second. Thank you so much. That was such a helpful overview. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague Elizabeth Betancourt, who's going to share more with you as far as the program overview. I have noticed that a few more folks have joined us since we got started. And if you haven't already, please open up the chat and share your name, your affiliation, and where you are joining us from. Go for it, Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And thanks so much, Tim. Those slides, that was the first time I've seen those pie chart graphics, and they're really striking and just speak to the importance, as Director Shabazian mentioned as well, the importance of projects like this that add value to what otherwise would be waste from our forests. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of where we're at with the project or the program as a whole. As many of you know, this was budget language included in the 21-22, so this year's budget, the year we're currently in, and the money will be allocated in 22-23. So if the budget passes as planned on July 1 this year, the funding will be awarded to the DOC and we'll be able to start the program in earnest. David, Director Shabazian, and Tim talked about the project objectives and the intent of this program. There's some information on the agenda as well, and I realize we don't have the agenda up on our website, but we'll make sure to get it up there. But the program objectives can also be found on the program fact sheet, which is available on our website. As far as expected timeline, I mentioned that the funds should be available to use as of the new fiscal year, July 1 of this year. We're expecting to do this project in 2 phases. We'd love to hear from you today as to whether that's a good idea or not. So we're expecting phase 1 to be smaller awards. Just as an example, this isn't saying this is what we're going to do, but just as an example, we're looking at maybe awards of $10,000 to $100,000, up to maybe $1 million total in the phase 1 award package. So maybe 10 or 15 awards. And then we would also give the awardees 6 months to do work on their proposal. So get outtake agreements in place, maybe purchase land or getting lease agreements in place. And then phase 2 would be the larger awards, so talking maybe $10 to $20 million, and those awards would be made to the successful phase 1 applicants in probably April, May, June of 2023. So it's a very loose description of the concept that we're working with as far as awarding these funds. Again, today we're looking for input from you on that and many other things. You'll notice the request for information workshop questions are also on our webpage. So we'd encourage you, if you have input on any of those topics or anything more that we forgot to include on that list, please add your input on those topics. We wanted to talk a little bit today about economic justice and public health objectives. You'll notice that public health is one of the program objectives, and that's in terms of forest health, community health, wildfire and smoke in the air that affects all Californians. I think none of us will ever forget the photos of downtown San Francisco choked with wildfire smoke from the last few years. So we're really looking to address public health through forest health, but also economic justice. When we're talking about investing in the Sierra Nevada, we're looking at not only the impact of this program on forest health, but also on small communities who otherwise may not have a whole lot of economic opportunities. Communities who maybe were affected by the downturn in timber production in the 1980s. We're really looking for multiple wins for the community in this process. And then I know Tim, thank you so much, Tim, for also presenting a little bit of the complementary state programs. There are many state and federal programs out there that are complementary to this process. So Department of Energy grants through the infrastructure bill. There, of course, are CAL FIRE grants. There's the Catalyst Fund through the Governor's Office of Business. And I know Dan will talk a little bit about that later. But we encourage you to take advantage of any and every opportunity to make sure that these projects are successful on the ground. And so if you have questions about connecting with any of those programs, we may not be experts in Department of Energy, for example, but we certainly would be able to put you in contact with people who are. So we are looking to galvanize and collaborate with many other state and federal agencies to make sure that we are funding projects that do good for your communities and do good for the state of California. So with that, Sarah, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Appreciate you. Okay, so let's see here. Maybe I'm one slide too much. I'm going to take down the slide deck for a minute because I'm going to welcome our colleagues, Dan Adler and Michael McGuire. So Dan's going to go first, then Michael, I'll just let you all know that this is going to be probably just under half an hour. We'll do some Q&A, and then especially for those of you who missed agenda review, we're going to take a 5-minute break just before or around 2 p.m. So you're on.
Thank you, Sarah. This is Dan Adler with GoBiz and the Infrastructure Bank. It's great to be with you today. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to run through a few things that are relevant for what GoBiz and iBank are up to, and then maybe share a thought or two about this RFI and why it's poised to, I think, be really transformational in the market, not just for California. And I'll turn it over quickly to my man Mike McGuire to talk about what OPR is up to. So of interest, I think, immediately is the nature of the Climate Catalyst Fund, which you just heard mentioned. This is now a new fund at the State Infrastructure Bank. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it, and if you've already expressed interest, we're working through getting a follow-up to everybody that's shown some interest in what we're up to. It's a $50 million new lending facility. It's permanent capital, so when it comes back, it gets relent. So it will hopefully outlast us all until the end of this problem. It's designed to be flexible and supportive of projects on the ground, only in California, and best thought of as sort of a lever to other investors. We want to be kind of the deal closing money, and that can be a very low interest loan. It can be flexible on its terms, on its tenor of repayment, and we can also do loan guarantees. And I think we're going to get a lot of interesting work done in the guarantee track by convincing other lenders and private capital providers that this is a place where they can actually grow a business. So this is the side of the equation that takes this massive biomass problem, and particularly the lower value biomass, and thinks about markets and what market forces can do for us to help pull us out of this challenge. So that's the Catalyst Fund. We're looking to get busy in the coming months. So if you haven't already reached out through iBank, please do so. But it's part of a sort of a nested set of programs at GoBiz that are also relevant. And GoBiz is the parent to iBank. It has the role of driving economic activity in the state for priority industries. And we're excited to recently have sort of expanded the focus of GoBiz into sustainability with a focus initially, in particular, on forest biomass utilization. So that means regional specialists and part in this workshop exercise, helping the state design the criteria that will be used to evaluate the selection and drive that capital out the door. These are globally relevant issues. This is a chance to demonstrate breakthrough technology. And California is a leader and has been a leader forever. But at this moment, carbon negative in the fuel sector is a challenge the world is really just waking up to. And we are years ahead with meaningful capital and all the thought leadership, including our industry and nonprofit and academic partners. We have to seize it. And we have to seize it in the context of deploying this money well and thinking about what happens next. Where are the markets? Where's the scale capital? How do we make this a growth opportunity for equity and inclusion and not just an interesting science project? That's my bottom line. And I'll turn it over to my friend, Mike McGuire, to tell us how we're going to get there.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for setting the stage there. I think the work that GoBiz is doing is really essential in this entire scope of things. The one piece that's really kind of been missing is looking at how we can address the feedstock barriers. I think to really kind of get towards being able to generate greater economic development and being able to drive further forest management and being able to, generate greater wood utilization, the infrastructure needs to be there. The Catalyst Fund is a big piece that can really help close that gap to get the infrastructure that either is on the ground that exists, modified and up and running, or additional projects that need to increase in terms of scale and production, looking at different innovative wood-based products. That's kind of the name of the game. So the OPR feedstock pilot projects are really looking at aiming towards how we can address the feedstock barriers challenge. Essentially, what we're looking to do is to more or less revolutionize the feedstock supply chain logistics component of things. We understand that for the private capital to really come in and be able to lift the industry up, the available feedstock supply needs to be there. Now, of course, we know the supply is there, but the long-term feedstock contracts that are needed to be able to generate greater investment down the line need to be there in place to be able to push this initiative further and forward. So what the feedstock pilots are really looking like, a quick overview. Roughly about $3 million was funded from the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Early Action Package last year, $2.5 million of which is going to support the new long-term woody feedstock pilot projects, roughly about $500,000 per project. We've got an additional $350,000 that we're putting into a feedstock and aggregation mapping tool, which will essentially be looking to integrate 3 different components, one of which is the CBREC model up at Humboldt State University, now known as Cal Poly Humboldt, that really looks at like the life cycle analysis and the carbon intensity of feedstock mobilization, and integrating that with the DSS model at UC Davis that really looks at the techno-economic kind of situation where, what does it cost to harvest and transport feedstock, and then integrating that with a digital marketplace for woody biomass, connecting the buyers and the sellers. So that's kind of what the project looks like as a whole. This was really founded out of Objective 3.10 out of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. And again, we're really going to be testing a variety of new mechanisms, looking at feedstock aggregation, really addressing the feedstock contract barriers that exist, and what are the organizational innovations that need to be developed and deployed to be able to essentially operate as feedstock brokers in the pilot project regions. Now, OPR has 5 different pilot projects, 5 different regions. Many of them are multi-county regions. Some of them are single county regions. For example, Marin County is one. We've got the North Coast, Shasta and Lassen, the Tahoe Basin, and the Central Sierra region itself. So some of these, again, very different voting demographics, very different feedstock types, very different geographies. So, each of these pilots are going to be tasked with, conducting organizational studies and trying to figure out, how can we stand up a sustainable financing model for each of the pilots for them to be able to operate in perpetuity long term. What their funding mechanisms will differ. What the local land use authorities that each of the local governments will be delegating to these joint powers authorities will be different. So we got a lot of research to do, but the overall objective again is to really improve feedstock supply chain logistics and be able to create these entities that will have the authority, the resources, and the governance structure to be able to offer and initiate long-term feedstock contracts. A lot of the deliverables will look like, governance structure implementation plans, long-term entity action plans, looking at maybe even feedstock, feedstock feasibility assessments, community engagement workshops, maybe even sort yards, log decks, wood product campus feasibility studies, et cetera. So a lot of deliverables, a lot of activities are going to be occurring under the feedstock pilots. And we're really lucky to have all of our state partners with GoBiz, DOC, CAL FIRE, the Board of Forestry, Joint Institute, et cetera, Sierra Nevada Conservancy that are helping us as we work through this exercise. So happy to open it up for questions or pass it back to Dan or any of our other colleagues here on the line.
Wow, that was fantastic. Okay. Questions, comments? We've got 60 of you here. Who wants to kick us off? We have like a really nice amount of time to have a back and forth. Let's see. Anyone? You could use the chat or the Q&A function.
And Sarah, maybe while we're
Yeah, go for it.
just one thing to really draw out that Michael mentioned in the deliverables, kind of the outcomes for the OPR work. And we don't want to put too much emphasis or too much burden on this exercise because it's brilliantly conceived. It's relatively lightly funded, at least for now. So we have to be mindful that if this thing demonstrates like a joint powers authority model that can really make feedstock agreements work at the sort of initial phase of aggregation, what does that mean for the businesses that come next? And so the linkage with this pilot and with the Catalyst Fund really goes to the nature of demand that we then signal to those aggregators. So for people who are thinking about this pilot or their own projects, trying to make those gears mesh, so that when the JPAs are trying to design a contract that meets the needs of the marketplace, we have to make sure that the market participants are there and ready to speak to it.
Yeah, great. Well said. Okay, we've got a couple questions. I'm going to read them out loud. Let's see here. From Nelson, where do we find more details for these 5 feedstock pilots, and what is the time schedule for having a feedstock marketplace?
Well, in terms of more resources for the pilots, OPR is building a webpage currently that will house a variety of resources, including quick start permitting guides for biomass businesses, a funding FAQ doc that will just kind of list the available state and federal grants that are available in the biomass utilization space. We'll also be providing copies of the project proposals for each of the 5 pilots, examples of their deliverables once they are made available, links to the feedstock mapping tools that we're developing as well. So again, this will be available by the end of the month. We will have the webpage up and running on OPR's webpage. Between now and then, if you need any additional resources, like a one-page overview, copy of a PowerPoint that I commonly give, just feel free to shoot me an email and I can share that information with you.
And the question of when the marketplace takes shape, that's a big one. This is the early stages of market formation, but when we have a full biomass feedstock market up and running in California, there's a lot of other steps between now and then.
Oh, and I'll include my email here to everybody. But yeah, I mean, we just from the OPR perspective, we expect a lot of the deliverables.
I have
to
a
be
quick
coming back. Or go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead, Sarah.
So I just want to double check. I don't know if it's on my side, but some of the audio for me was a little bit slow, and I don't know if it's only my connection or if it's, you never know whose side it's on. So if anybody wants to in the chat confirm if they can hear, and then also for these, another thing we can do is you all answering these live is obviously the way we want to go, but if you want to put a little follow up in writing in the chat, I bet that would help folks too. So keep going, Mike.
Yeah, sure. I was going to say, in terms of the timelines, we're completing the contracting phase right now. We suspect it will take about 18 months for these pilots to be able to put together their deliverables. So, roughly about the end of 2023, maybe early 2024, these entities will be, gathering and communicating within their steering committees, negotiating with the local governments to be able to assess what local land use authorities can be delegated to the JPAs, and then the actual contracts of creating the JPAs themselves within the pilot project regions would be just a few months after that. So we're hoping, through this next phase, we can really get into, get beyond the research and really kind of getting into the implementation and development and deployment of the JPAs themselves, roughly, 18 to 24 months down the line.
Can you guys see all those questions? Anything else either of you wants to add? I also can read them.
I don't see any. Let's see. Maybe I can go back here.
So we've got, who are the partners for the OPR feedstock pilots? How much is available? Is that
Gotcha.
separate from the DOC grant?
Yeah, so it's separate from the Department of Conservation grant. There are currently 5 project leads right now, fiscal agents. Each of them will have a variety of different subcontractors that will be, conducting a lot of the research efforts for each of these pilots. Each of them are either a combination of resource conservation districts, who are the project lead, or county governments. The availability of total was $3 million in funding. We have at this point essentially dedicated $500,000 for each project. The remaining $500,000 goes to the feedstock mapping tool and for OPR administration costs. So at this point, the funding has been dedicated to the existing projects. And for what reason, I can't see any other questions on here on my end. So maybe if there are any other coming in, Sarah, you could just let me know.
Sure, sure. Dan, anything you want to add with what you're seeing?
Yeah, sure. Just on the available capital at iBank, the Climate Catalyst Fund, we have 47 million from late last year allocated to forest biomass utilization. So that's what we're actively looking to program in loans or guarantees. And just anything under $1 million, we'd look to probably structure as a guarantee to another lender. And then the max size is not fixed, but probably in the sort of $10 to $15 million range, so we can support a range of projects. Should have said this, I'll take this chance to, we can do forest biomass utilization in the form of wood products, in the form of energy production, and we can also support activity that is sort of the logistics and supply chain. So equipment needed for clearing mills, innovations, but traditional things as well. And this is separate from the DOC grant program. This is an entirely independent funding source.
Great. Anyone want to speak to who's developing the mapping tool?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Now I see the little Q&A tab here. That was
Oh,
my
cool.
bad. Sorry.
No, we're all still getting used to it. It's cool.
Yep. Yeah. So the feedstock mapping tool, the two entities that have the existing components that already exist are funded by Energy Commission grants. What was it over the last couple of years? UC Davis and Cal Poly Humboldt. Those pieces are already complete. That'll be integrated through a shared platform at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo DX Hub. Our partners there, Nick and Darren, are running the shop there, developing the scope of work as we speak, and we'll be executing a grant agreement, or I'm sorry, an interagency agreement with them later this month to be able to get the work going.
Great. So do you guys want to speak to what's been brought up about Southern Sierra not being included? I mean, so you could talk about that specific area,
Sure.
but any area that isn't included at this moment.
Yeah, I think the two areas that we would like to see addressed through a future funding cycle with the pilots would be either the Southern Sierras or the Central Coast. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but just from conversations I've had with folks in Eastern Fresno County and Sierra RCD, there may be a project that brewing there, funded through their own partners in the region, as opposed to OPR funding. So happy to expand on that if anyone has any questions, or to forward them any questions over to John Haywood and Steve Hayes over there to answer. But certainly an opportunity for a project to develop there. And if not through this round, then maybe the next, certainly looking either there or the Central Coast.
Michael, it's also, it may be worth saying this. I think this is true, that this was a sort of a partnership model where these local groups that were farther along are interested in engaging with this process. It wasn't that the state selected groups and excluded others. It was really almost organic, but certainly something that could grow.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Dan.
Dan, did you see the follow-up of the 47 million?
Yeah. No, it's not a grant program. It's deliberately styled to complement the state's grant programs, of which, I will note there are more than 40 giving out $3 billion of climate grants, and we have very little in the realm of a green bank. So the intent is to position the state's intervention later in the process when things are more ready to scale. So we have that tool now available as well.
Great. What qualifies as carbon capture and sequestration under the DOC funding? Specifically, is biochar on or off the table? Who wants to take that?
DOC should
Goes Dan.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Elizabeth, you want to come on and talk to that one?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That might be a good negativity sector, although certainly, Michael, I know that with this so add to it, but also might be a good question for the next segment.
Yeah, you were breaking up there a little bit, Elizabeth, but yeah, that's something that I'll be covering in my section in the carbon negative piece. So if you can hold that question until we get there, that would be great.
Perfect.
I'm really biting my tongue because I love biochar. Dan knows it too.
You don't work for DOC though.
That's true. Very, very true.
Okay, so Dan and Mike, as you scan through these questions and the Q&A, anything else we want to add in?
Tony Ferenzi's question, what do you expect the marketplace to do to feedstock pricing? Lower pricing seems likely. It's potentially the case. Yeah, I mean, just basic economic logic, the easier something is to get for folks, drives down the price. But that's why we have to stand up the demand side as well. So I think we need to think of these as related activities, and part of what we're lending against is the electricity markets. So biomass and some potentially bioram projects that can feed into there, they create demand that drives the price back up even as you aggregate more. But we need more demand signals like this pilot program, and like the natural gas work that the PUC is doing, and what we can hopefully engineer around construction materials as well.
All right, anything else you guys want to add in? Any other questions? Participants? Okay. All right.
Preston Jordan just added one.
Okay, go for it.
Can the RPS for electricity from forestry biomass be lifted? Meaning the limitation on biomass RPS? I mean, it's under statute right now, at least the version I've seen most recently, it's not eligible. Should it be eligible? I mean, we've been fighting about that and fighting about hydro in our renewables definitions for 30 years now, probably. You could make a case, or you could just utilize the Bioram program or Biomat programs, or do both, prove that this technology is as clean as we say it is. But I think that's going to be a hard push, frankly. This is high priced electricity. I think we might be better off looking at liquid and gaseous fuels instead.
All righty. I mean, we could always circle back to questions for you too.
Sure.
But if I don't see anything else, I think I'm going to move on. I think what we'll do is we will go to Rizaldo, and then we'll take a short break, everybody. So thank you so much, Mike and Dan.
Yep. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, Rizaldo Aldas. Let's see if I can find you on screen.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me okay? Quick sound check.
Perfect. You are up. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself? I'm going to pin you also.
All right. Well, thank you, Sarah, and good afternoon. I'll say we're now switching to the discussion of the technology, one of the most critical components of this whole effort of creating carbon negative hydrogen or liquid fuel from forest biomass. And I probably would recommend to twist a little bit the format of discussion from the previous section, in that I think for this workshop, the intent really is to hear feedback from you, from project developers, technology developers. Give us your comments, suggestions on technological considerations. And we have 3 questions to serve as a starting point. If you haven't seen those, I think there was a link provided by Justin there. And so for me, it's really valuable to use the rest of the time, because we don't have a lot of time, to hear your feedback. But let me provide a little bit more of introduction. Yeah, so Sarah, I have to introduce myself. My name is Rizaldo Aldas. I'm with the California Energy Commission's Energy Research and Development Division. I'm the technical lead for the Renewable Energy and Advanced Generation R&D program. It's a program that covers different renewable energy resources and technology. And bioenergy is a component of our R&D program. Like for instance, we have funded thermochemical and biochemical conversion technology development and demonstration projects. We have funded those in the past, and we are still funding them. Our main funding comes from electricity and natural gas ratepayers. And until very recently, the primary intent of the projects were on generating electricity or producing heat and renewable gas that will help reduce the state's reliance on fossil fuel. So under the electricity program, we are funding community scale gasification projects in 4 locations in the state that will convert forest biomass to electricity. So these projects are at a scale of 3 megawatt, and they are participating in the Biomat program. And under the gas R&D program, we have a couple of projects that are developing technologies for the production of high quality renewable gas using woody biomass. So the intent is produce pipeline quality biomethane out of syngas from gasification. This could be a key process for succeeding steps like, for instance, on-site use or delivery via pipeline, or possibly further conversion to hydrogen. But at the moment, those scopes are outside of the current projects. And then lastly, for some of you who are keeping track of our solicitations, last month in March, we released our Notice of Proposed Award for our grant solicitation on low carbon hydrogen production. So the projects proposed for award in that solicitation were mainly focused on converting biogas from anaerobic digestion of organic waste to hydrogen. So I would say a little different as far as the technological requirements for forced biomass, but I think the components for gas reforming and hydrogen gas separation could possibly be useful as well. And then just to kind of summarize for those projects, I think overall, even though the current gasification projects that I mentioned that we're funding now are not for producing hydrogen or liquid fuel, at least the ones that are currently active, I think the basic conversion technology and the associated lessons learned when it comes to construction and operation, as well as non-technological challenges such as financing and permitting, those could be useful for the current efforts moving forward. And then I will also would like to comment before I open it up for feedback or suggestions. I'll comment that gasification technology is considered by many as mature technology. However, there are still what I will call opportunity areas for improvement, and that could range from the gasifier itself, the whole aspects of the balance of plant or balance of system, like from feedstock management, material flow, the extra steps needed, such as catalytic reforming, if, for instance, the operation is on closer to pyrolysis where the system is producing much more hydrocarbons that needs to be handled, and also tars that needs to be cleaned up or converted. Use of water gas shift reactors, hydrogen gas separation technology, and just the whole handling or storage and use of the product hydrogen and liquid fuel. And then key challenges that I think many of you know for hydrogen or liquid fuel production via gasification involve the aspect or issue of costs. That could be capital cost or levelized cost of product, and then biomass feedstock costs. And you will notice for those who have seen the set of questions that we propose that at least a couple of those guiding questions are in a way associated with the issue of costs. So with that, I think I would like to open up the floor for comments or suggestions, particularly with respect to the posted questions. And for those of you who don't have access to those questions, allow me to read those. Number one, what is the appropriate technological maturity for individual components and or integrated systems of supported projects? Should the solicitation incorporate formal references to the Department of Energy's Technology Readiness Assessment Guide? So essentially, this assessment guide is a scale from 1 to 9, where lower numbers like 1 to 3 is more of an early stage concept development and laboratory experimentation, all the way to pilot scale demonstration in TRL 6, full scale demonstration in 7, and then up to full commercial operation in TRL 9. We provided the link to that assessment guide if anyone is interested to look at the details. Our second question is there a particular size of facility we should expect? For instance, is there a throughput and or production capacity that should be considered for the future solicitation? And then third, should facilities be designed to process a minimum amount of forest biomass tonnage annually for a project to be eligible for funding? And then if there are important information or questions that are not captured by these questions, I encourage you to go ahead and share those to Elizabeth, and others in the panel would be taking notes. And again, I'd like to open this up. I think that those will be valuable in helping better shape the substation that the Department of Conservation will be putting forward. So yeah, Sarah and I could be going back and forth, facilitating any comments or feedback that you have.
Anybody? Let's see here. Let's see here. Does hydrogen production via electrolysis with carbon negative electricity, BECCS, count as carbon negative fuels under your guidelines?
Yeah, so those are the kind of suggestions that you can put out there. I'll just comment, and Elizabeth could fill in that currently this is obviously more focused on biomass to hydrogen or liquid fuel. So potentially, in my opinion, could be more along the line of gas production and reforming rather than electrolysis. But again, your comments or suggestions in that space are welcome.
Okay. Let me read this next one. Just to clarify for group biomass, a facility may qualify for RPS certification if it generates electricity using a biomass fuel. When applying for RPS certification of a facility using biomass, the applicant must submit information on the type and source of the biomass used or planned to be used at the facility. If the facility is using fuel that results from biomass conversion as defined in Public Resources Code 40106, documentation must be submitted to confirm the fuel was produced through a process that meets and satisfies. Okay, I guess that's not a question.
Yeah, that's clarifying for me. Thank you, Christiana. Sorry, this is Dan.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, you guys. All right. I should have read through it before I started reading, you guys. Apologies. Let's see. We are combining multiple TRL 8-9 technologies to get from wood waste to H2. I would imagine the phase 2 grants would at least want to be TRL 7, if not higher. Any comment on that one?
Yeah, possibly. And again, we'll take note of that. Given the phases that is being considered, I think that's the logical readiness level of the project.
Are any of the gasification projects funded by the CEC employing oxygen or steam-blown gasification rather than air-blown gasification?
Currently, those are mainly air-blown gasification. We had one technology that are looking at the use of steam also. Again, these are under development, and there's some challenges as far as moving forward. It's not final, but I think all of these would be more of an air-blown system rather than having a system that purifies the air and separate the oxygen.
All right. If the pathway to carbon negative fuels does not go through gasification, pyrolysis, sorry, you guys, I don't know that word. Will it still be considered or of interest?
Yeah, I think that's the kind of comment that you can recommend to the Department of Conservation. I think there is potentially a thermochemical process or high temperature process that may not necessarily be called gasification or pyrolysis that is able to produce hydrogen as well. And I think if you can send details to the Department of Conservation, that will be taken into consideration.
Thank you. Okay, I think a number of us are having some internet stability issues. Here's a question. Sorry if he missed it. Brad is wondering, was there a minimum amount of fuel production biomass consumed to be considered?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That is exactly one of the questions that we put out there. We're looking forward to comments from experienced, not necessarily, but everyone who are considering the technology. I understand that there are, I think, maybe 8 or so projects that are preparing to move forward with hydrogen or fuels project. And so if you can comment or suggest on the requirements for feedstock or kind of product production. I think that will be helpful. We can look at some of the projects in terms of production and use as a reference, but can feedback from developers would be helpful in this case.
Great. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, here's an FYI. Yosemite Clean will be utilizing roughly 100,000 BDT per year per project.
Thank you for the comment. I wonder if there's a way to open up the microphone for if anyone wants to kind of talk or clarify or expand on their questions. I think might be.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you can probably use the raise hand option, and then Sarah or Elizabeth can unmute you too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would love that. Oh, okay. Let's see. Oh, look at that. Okay, Daniel. Let me see. Allow to talk. I've clicked the button. Let's see.
Great. Sounds like I'm on.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, Rosaldo, the reason why I was asking about oxygen or steam-blown gasification rather than air-blown gasification is because those processes tend to really lend themselves to producing a really easy and accessible stream of carbon dioxide that can be captured and stored underground. It's also typically what I imagine hydrogen or renewable natural gas production processes, or it's certainly kind of any gasification and then downstream catalytic conversion of syngas would likely employ as well. So just wanted to ask about that because I think it might be key to some of the carbon negativity considerations here. And I will say, I do think just while I'm on the line, I think there's two really interesting questions that are arising here that I think are as yet unresolved. One is the role that biochar can play or cannot play in the questions of carbon negativity required by the grant. We do have voluntary protocols to quantify biochar-based carbon removal that are gaining traction again in voluntary markets, but no integration into current regulatory programs. And so, very interesting question. I think another unresolved question is whether or not and how these funds are going to be used to promote a mixture of both industrial scale conversion of forest biomass to fuels compared to community scale conversion of biomass to fuels. I think both advance really meaningful goals for the state, but they take on very different sizes and models. So just wanted to add that commentary and appreciate the opportunity. Thanks all.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just to add to your first comment on the oxygen separation from the air, I agree with you. I think that will be a kind of a key step if the system would be designed to be producing hydrogen, for instance, and a better capture of your carbon dioxide. As mentioned earlier, for the most part, our projects were designed for electricity generation and kind of capturing the syngas and use that as kind of a fuel for power generation. And so for projects that are thinking about well, fuels production or hydrogen production, those are kind of important consideration. I mentioned a while ago one project that we were kind of working with where they are considering use of steam in their system, and hydrogen is kind of in their radar for future, kind of, even though the focus of our funding was on for electricity generation, they have that kind of vision that they could kind of evolve into kind of hydrogen production. So they have that in their mind. But again, there are challenges, say non-technological challenges for that. And then I appreciate the comments on the biochar and as well as the scale. I think the biochar and the carbon negativity will be covered in the next session.
Okay, so let me just double check. So Daniel, was that just you talking, or Daniel Sanchez, did you want to speak?
Forgive me, that was me speaking earlier.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to double check.
Yes.
Someone asked who it was and I thought it was you, and then, okay, so now your hand's down. All right. Anyone else want to add in at this moment? Well, what we're going to do is 2:04. We are going to take a break until 2:15, and then we're going to come back. So if you think of a question, you have something you want to add in, you can always do that. Then
Sarah, I think there's still one question that probably
go for it, please.
For the next section. It's from Kelly McIntosh. It says here, does a project need to be carbon neutral or negative to receive funding? Some project sites are not conducive to carbon capture and storage or near geological sequestration sites. I think that's ready for the next discussion.
Thank you so much for reading that one and clarifying. Okay, so Rosaldo, thank you so much. And I'm sure people are going to have more questions for you too. So it's 2:05. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We will be back at 2:15 and we will continue. See you in 10 minutes. So folks, next we're going to dive into this fantastic presentation that we are going to get from Justin Ong and Anthi Alexiadis. And Justin, I'm gonna go mute so you can take us through.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So this section will focus on the carbon negative fuel requirement of the program and queue up some of the questions we've already received thus far. So my name is Justin Ong, and I work on clean energy policy at the Natural Resources Agency. My background is in federal innovation and carbon management policy at the federal level, and have since transitioned to California to facilitate related policies such as this program at the state level. So I'll be tag teaming on a few slides with Anthi. And yeah, Anthi, would you like to give a short introduction?
Sure, thanks, Justin. Hi, everyone. My name is Anthi Alexiadis from the California Air Resources Board in the Industrial Strategies Division. And Sarah, if you could flip to the next slide for me. So there's several ways that this pilot program really intersects with CARB's various climate as well as air quality programs. But the most notable or maybe overarching one that I wanted to highlight is the scoping plan update. So this is a process that we go through every 5 years to develop the long-term strategies, the suite of regulations, incentive programs, et cetera, that are going to be needed to achieve the state's climate goals. And this year, one of those key objectives is to lay out a path to achieving carbon neutrality statewide no later than 2045. So we're really excited to be engaging in this effort because we recognize that the projects that will be funded through this pilot program will really complement the scoping plan strategy, right? So that's not going to be finalized until later this year, but we have some preliminary modeling results that we've gone over in public workshops. And those suggest that, for example, we're going to need a lot more hydrogen to provide energy for the hard to decarbonize sectors, including transportation and industry. And that carbon dioxide removal strategies are going to be important for achieving carbon neutrality. So of course, that's alongside our continued efforts to electrify and decarbonize the state's energy supply more broadly and to enhance the carbon storage capacity of our natural and working lands. So I'll be walking us through some questions on life cycle analysis in a bit, but for now, back to you, Justin.
Great, thanks. Can we go to the next slide, please? So to set the stage again, I know other presentations have alluded to it, but this is the specific legislative text that really got this program going. And as you can see, it makes clear the intent is to create carbon negative hydrogen or fuels using a life cycle analysis. It calls out some very specific things like transportation emissions of feedstocks, produced fuels, and CO2 sequestration. But other than that specific direction, it's relatively silent on implementation details. So for this reason, we've teed up a bunch of questions that are relevant to that process, and we'd really appreciate your feedback on. So next slide, please. So I stole this graphic from a National Academies of Sciences report on negative emission technologies, and it dives deep into the current slate of negative emission techs evaluated for deep decarbonization. And relevant to this program, the National Academies identified bioenergy with CCS tied to very specific pathways such as biochar, basalts, and other geologic formations. And so just wanted to use this as a rough guide for how we've been thinking about this program. And yeah, would appreciate questions and responses to the following slides. So next slide, please. So this slide poses a string of interrelated questions on eligible technologies and associated methodologies related to the program. Some of them are paraphrased from the list of workshop RFI questions on the website. And if you haven't seen those yet, they're listed in the chat, and are some of the specific areas that we're requesting feedback on. But on the first bullet, consistent with the direction laid out in SB 155, what are the universe of carbon negative approaches that should be eligible for the program? Earlier, we heard questions around biochar and specific CCS requirements. And so those are exactly the types of feedback that we'd like to hear more from you all about. We anticipate that geologic carbon dioxide sequestration will be a carbon negative pathway due to the nature of the language and technological maturity of the process. But we do hope to hear more about other pathways such as carbon utilization or biochar or other things that we may be missing. On the second bullet, for each of the approaches proposed in the above question, are there existing certifications or methodologies that would inform the quantification of carbon negativity? For example, geologic sequestration projects have several relevant federal, state, and nonprofit programs that can impact life cycle analysis calculations during the different phases of a project. And last, how might these proposed methodologies impact project and program implementation timelines? For example, on the carbon sequestration side of things, characterizing the subsurface, applying for and receiving the necessary permits for a carbon sequestration site can take several years, which frankly is probably beyond the timeline of this program. So viewing these three questions as a suite of interrelated questions would be great for public comment and feedback. And the last slide here that I'll be covering focuses on avoided emissions. We recognize that different carbon negative technologies have fundamentally different attributes, including their permanence and potential avoided emissions implications. And so along these lines, should projects be allowed to incorporate avoided emissions into their life cycle analysis calculations, such as the reduction in wildfire risks, and if so, how? So that's a lot of questions on our side, and I imagine we'll get a lot of feedback. But before we do, I'll pass it over to Amphi for a further discussion on life cycle analysis.
Okay, great. Thanks, Justin. All right, so yes, the next set of questions that we're going to dive into are related to the life cycle analysis methodology that will be used to evaluate the greenhouse gas performance or overall net negative emissions of each proposed project. I don't know, Justin, I was thinking we could have people raise hands and sort of go one by one. So do you want to back up and talk about negative emissions first, or just go ahead and I'll go through one by one, or we can just open it up for anyone to speak to any of these questions?
Do you want to run through your questions first? And then I think that might provide a more holistic back and forth.
That makes sense. Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, let's do that. Okay, great. So yeah, the first question is, how should the project's life cycle system boundary be defined? So the legislative text that Justin reviewed, which established this program, gives us some guidelines, right? Namely that a life cycle analysis needs to be conducted to compare the carbon emitted and sequestered, and that the emissions should include any transportation needs. But to my mind, that leaves a few open questions about the LCA. So one example that I could think of might be how the fuels or any co-products should be accounted for. So yeah, we'd like to get your thoughts on any sources or sinks that you think are important either to include or exclude from the life cycle analysis. The next question is about the global warming potential values that should be used to convert non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions to their carbon dioxide equivalents. So for some context on that, the state and national inventories use 100-year GWPs from the IPCC's 4th assessment report so that all of our inventories can be compared to one another. But there have been some updates to those values, and some argue that the use of shorter time horizons emphasizes the importance of achieving our near-term climate goals. So that's another thing we'd like to hear your input on. And then the third bullet here is about accounting timeframes. So here we're thinking about carbon flows that can be quantified within a year. Versus, are there aspects of projects where you think an annual carbon balance would be challenging or might omit some sources of emissions that you feel should be included in the analysis? And then finally, and this one wasn't on the list of questions online, but I thought it might be helpful to just sort of have a catch-all question here. So are there any recommendations that would help simplify the life cycle analysis for applicants? So for example, are there emission factors or assumptions that should be standardized across applications? And maybe another example is, if we were to specify the functional units or other LCA choices like allocation methods. So just a more general question to get your thoughts on there.
All right, anyone want to use the raise your hand function? Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's see. I'm going to show the hands. Hold on one second. Okay, so I'm going to go to Graham, then Daniel. And then Robert. Graham, can you?
Yes, am I coming over?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go for it.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Really appreciate all the work that went in to this discussion and webinar today. My name's Graham Noyes. I'm a regulatory attorney, do a lot of work with low carbon fuel standard in particular, and work with and represent many of the companies developing advanced technologies that use woody biomass and convert those to transportation fuels, whether it's hydrogen, RNG, or liquid fuels. Have to share the really strange juxtaposition today. I live up in the Sierra Nevada. I've spent the last several hours walking our neighborhood with a forester, coming up with a potential burn plan to reduce our local fire risk. And that came off of that a little bit early, so I could hear this entire webinar. But frankly, really informs my perspective on this, which is this SB 155 language and this program provides a real opportunity for the state to, I think, look expansively at how the life cycle analysis should work for California forests. The reality is in places like where I live, we've got literally people burning piles all the time because there's no place to go with the biomass. We've got uncontrolled wildfires. And we've got of course, the foresters regularly carrying out burns as well. And thus far, that reality has not been integrated into the LCFS program. And I understand that it's challenging to do that, but I don't think we need to be so constricted within this program structure not to recognize avoided emissions that are indeed very real out there. And use an accounting timeframe that's reasonable, particularly when you start to think about the economic consequences, the environmental consequences, and the public safety consequences. We have a fire, we have a crisis here, and the best way to mobilize this material and frankly to prevent it from being burned is to find downstream uses that really work at scale. And fuels are an extremely promising area. So I just wanted to provide this comment to think expansively here. Use this as it's obviously I would think a daunting project to integrate this into a new program, but it's well worth the effort. I think it's an opportunity for interagency coordination. I think bringing in a biochar component, which is another area of life cycle analysis that's challenging and frankly somewhat controversial, that this is another opportunity there, and this incrementally could really move California forward, not just in terms of advancing these technologies, but also in taking a fresh look at life cycle analysis as applied to wildfire and figuring out how to make the policy work to reduce the risk and reduce the greenhouse gases and the criteria pollutants that are coming out both from the wildfires and all the uncontrolled burns that are going on out there. So I guess there wasn't much of a question in there. I try not to provide a lot of commentary, but did appreciate this opportunity. Glad to hear any responses from Anthony or Justin on that.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Graham. Yeah, I think similar to what Director Shabazian had mentioned, DOC sees this as a model to show how not just the immediate forest biomass treated by this program can be done well, but also elsewhere throughout the Sierra Nevadas. So I think any feedback or particulars that you can give around avoided emissions or the time frame or the biochar considerations, that would be great. And as specific of recommendations that you have that we can weave into the program.
Anzi, anything you want to add in?
No, definitely appreciate the feedback. I guess one thing I would ask if you wanted to clarify, Graham, you mentioned the idea of using timeframes that sort of best reflect the benefits. And can you talk any more specifically about whether a shorter or longer timeframe would accomplish that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, kind of going back to the CAL FIRE slides, we saw just what a fire crisis we're in this state right now with the scale of the fires and the size of the fires that are happening. And as you know, Anthony, I've been in a lot of the discussions within the LCFS context about, well, what should CARB be recognizing avoided emissions from burn piles that would have been burnt from regular forest management activities, if we're able to document that, and even more so, should there be any recognition of avoided wildfires? And I think that when we're in a situation where we have all of the forest experts telling us that we need to get up to this 1 million acres a year of treatment goal out there in order to stave off these kinds of severe wildfires that we're immediately experiencing, it makes sense to be thinking in that relatively short time frame perspective as opposed to trying to look out over a century and look at a permanent standard like we have in the CCS protocol or the forest offset protocol out there. And so that's I think that could provide some flexibility for this program, and I'm hopeful that could also inform ultimately the LCFS and California GREET and be an effective policy tool that also meets the standards of scientific defensibility and credibility that everybody needs to see out there.
Thanks, Graham. Appreciate that.
Okay, so next we're going to go to Daniel and then Julia. Daniel, go for it. You're off mute, but I don't hear you. There we go. Okay, Julia, why don't I come to you and then we'll come back to Daniel.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. This is Julia Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California. This has been a really interesting workshop, and I want to thank Elizabeth and Sarah and everyone for organizing it and making it more of a conversation, which is really refreshing for a change. I have a couple of responses to the questions on negative carbon emissions. First, and well, I would say most importantly, but they're all important questions. I think it's really critical to include not just greenhouse gases, but short-lived climate pollutants. We know that black carbon is significantly more destructive to the climate than carbon dioxide, and that it is one of the major climate pollutants emitted from wildfires. Methane can also be emitted from wildfires, and I think several other climate pollutants. So we definitely should not limit the analysis or the life cycle analysis to just greenhouse gases, but short-lived climate pollutants also have to be included. But especially black carbon. Anthony's heard me say this in many of the scoping plan workshops, but I think a lot of state agencies and others forget that state law requires a 50% reduction in anthropogenic black carbon by 2030. Anthropogenic meaning human caused. There's no way that wouldn't include black carbon emissions from controlled burns, prescribed fire, pile and burn, and human caused wildfires. So I think we have to include black carbon emissions as well as the other greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of a time frame, I think this is a critical question, and Anthony mentioned that a lot of the recent science is pointing toward the need to use a 20-year global warming potential rather than a 100-year. And I think with the IPCC report that just came out in the last couple of days, the latest International Panel on Climate Change assessment, we are in so much more dire and urgent a situation than we thought even a year or two ago. The latest IPCC assessment says we have about 8 years at most to avoid totally catastrophic and largely irreversible climate change. So given that urgency, it doesn't make any sense to me to continue using 100-year global warming potentials, which also really downplay the significance of short-lived climate pollutants. So I really encourage all the state agencies to shift to a 20-year global warming potential. And finally, last question on life cycle analysis. I think there are a lot of factors to be included that Anthony and Justin and others have a better idea what they are. My only strong suggestion there is that we should be including the byproducts of bioenergy production in the life cycle analysis, and particularly biochar. I know there's still some uncertainty around biochar, but not to include it at all doesn't make sense at this point. We know that it can provide long duration carbon sequestration, and so it should be included in part of the life cycle analysis. Thank you. I know that's a lot, but you're raising really good questions.
Thank you, Julia. We just really appreciate the very specific and clear feedback. Thanks.
Great. All right, Daniel, you're up.
Outstanding. Great. Apologies for the delay earlier. I think some of the questions that Justin and Anthony brought up are some of the grand questions around forest biomass and life cycle assessment. And I think what we heard from Graham and Julia was an embrace of some of those really important questions that need to be figured out, like avoided wildfire, like avoided short-lived climate pollutants, and quite frankly, the climate impacts of black carbon, which are really fiercely contested. I think for the purposes of this program, I feel a little differently than how Graham and Julia feel. I'd recommend really focusing on a little more simplicity when talking about carbon negativity and talking about life cycle assessment. I think for the purposes of this program, we can think of the forest biomass that is sourced as waste biomass. That is biomass that would likely decompose or likely be burned in a burn pile. Now, again, I don't think we should really dive into all details about short-lived climate pollutants related to that, as well as the avoided emissions. I think that becomes incredibly fraught and complicated, hard to quantify, and I think it might undermine some of the other goals for this program, which really is the focus on physical removal of carbon from the atmosphere. I think both of those, that can be achieved two different ways. One of those would be carbon capture and storage of biogenic carbon. The other one would be creation of recalcitrant biochar or durable biochar from biogenic carbon. And I think that's really the crux of the carbon negativity assessment that needs to be applied here for the purposes of this program. And that's very different, of course, from encouraging further assessment and further quantification of avoided emissions, as well as the impacts of short-lived climate pollutants. But I think it's important to draw that distinction there here. I did also just want to note that there are what I consider to be reputable methodologies to establish the durability of biochar, developed both by the International Biochar Initiative, as well and embraced by the European Biochar Commission, the European Biochar Certificate and the Carbon Sink Certificate as well. I mentioned before, they've been used in voluntary programs. They, involve testing of the chemical composition of biochar, as well as disposition of its or understanding and disposition of its ultimate fate and use as a product. Happy to share more information about that, but I really do think that for the purposes of this program, the focus needs to be on physical carbon removal, and we can simplify the system boundary significantly from that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Sorry, let me respond really quickly on that. I definitely would appreciate hearing more from project proponents about the trade-off that Dan alluded to in terms of simplicity. I think quantifying, the forest ecosystem, carbon stock changes and emissions and flows over various periods of time does add a lot of complexity. And I'm really interested to hear whether, how folks are thinking of that as, being critical to be reflected in the assessment versus, I think, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that a sort of inevitable trade-off of that is that projects are then competing based on the feedstock sourcing plans, those forest management elements of the project plan, right, and less on the technologies that they're utilizing in the fuels or other products that they're producing. So definitely not an easy question to ask, and as Graham I think mentioned, it makes sense to approach those things differently in different programs depending on the objectives. So yeah, I appreciate you raising that, Dan, and definitely interested to hear where others fall on that question.
Great. Okay, so next we're going to go to Robert and then Chris.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yep, you sound great.
Okay, great. I'm driving. I apologize. So I think I'm going to echo Daniel's comments, and I'm coming from the perspective of a project developer. We are in the process of trying to develop a series of cellulosic ethanol plants in California. Anybody who's doing a liquid fuel biofuels program in California is calculating their carbon intensity, their CI score, as per the requirements of the LCSF. And my first comment is adding a whole lot of additional, life cycle analysis work on top of a CI that I'm already paying a consultant to do the work on, and I'm going to have to work through a pathway with CARB, is daunting. I'm just like, oh boy, another expense, another thing I need to do. And so I would really hope that we could start with and focus on, well, what's your CI? And I'll just say, just as an example, our CI is our initial look, and it's preliminary, is about a 27. 5 or 6 of those points are the impact of diesel chippers chipping the waste wood that we were intending to use. So if we can, so it's looking down into the supply chain and how we're getting our material. I would love this crowd and everybody to work together to get CARB to find ways of adding the benefits that we bring to the forest by utilizing that biomass into the CI score. But for now, that's not there. And I think, maybe there's extra bonus points or something the Department of Conservation can help bring a little extra benefit to. The other point I'll make is the CI score recognizes the benefits of CCS. If we just take the pure CO2 stream that we're going to be able to capture off the ethanol production process, that moves our CI score down to about -30. And if we also do post-combustion CO2 capture, we can bring it down to -100. So there is there is a mechanism within the CI score at least to capture CCS. So my hope is that we start with the CI score for the LCFS program that anybody doing biofuels is going to have to do anyway, and not add a whole lot of additional analysis to that. If just because, especially, I don't know how detailed we need to go beyond that. I'm sure there may be some, but I think anybody doing a biofuels program is going down that route, and let's try to utilize that tool rather than create a new one.
Thanks, Robert. Any comments before we go to Chris? All right, Christopher Wood, you are up.
Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Oh, wonderful. And I apologize if my mic quality is lousy. Happily, Robert has made about half of my point for me. And Robert, I would love to connect offline sometime. I'm quite interested in what you're up to. Coming from the kind of biorefining technology side, and obviously coming at it from the direction of the technologies I've worked on, being able to include the carbon value of co-products is very important from my perspective. And that can be things like biochar, which my technology does not produce, or things like co-product chemicals and things like that you pick up on the side that are offsetting carbon emissions, but you need a detailed enough LCA to be able to cover them. I believe, based on my understanding, and Robert probably knows this better than I do at this point, the system used by CARB for the LCFS, I believe, can take those kind of co-products into account. Obviously, there's a lot of detail and discussion about how you attribute them and all of that, but I do want to say, that from my perspective, it's really important to keep potential co-products and their carbon intensities in mind as you kind of clump everything together. And to Robert's point, being able to use an existing measure such as the carbon intensity used in the LCFS would really help a lot to simplify things.
All right, let's see. Graham.
Thanks. Glad to have a chance to follow along on Dan's comments, which I greatly respect here. It's great to have a group discussion opportunity on this. The reality is, having worked on a woody biomass pathway now for a couple of years, is there are not any woody biomass pathways that CARB has yet been willing to recognize as carbon neutral under the California grade system. So, you know, we do need, in order to hit this qualification, you need to have a CCS component, which is essentially typically adding another project to the first project that you're doing. So a tremendous additional capital expenditure. And we don't have any approved CCS projects yet under the LCFS. So that's adding a really high bar to this from a practical perspective that I just want to make, you know, really clear from someone who's been working with companies on both of those fronts. I do think Dan's solution is an elegant one, which is to take a simple, you know, really forest biofuels approach to this. And I just think that this is an area where I do think long term, we need to have that deeper discussion about looking at the kinds of issues that Julie and I were raising. But from a practical standpoint and from a timing standpoint, we need to do something that's relatively simple along the lines of what Dan said in terms of this measurement of carbon neutrality or carbon negativity. So that this program can go forward and can be implemented, and good technologies can meet the standard, and then longer term engage in that process. So I do appreciate the chance to give a follow-up comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Tom, you are up. I think, there we go. Try it, Tom.
Okay, we're good.
I hear you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I appreciate it. Tom Johnson. I work with Placer County Water Agency, local water agency, heavily invested in watershed health, investing staff resources and revenues in a number of clearing project, biomass reduction, and so forth. And from that perspective, you know, there's a lot of permitting and logistics to do watershed management, biomass reduction projects, as you all well know. I'd like to just come from that perspective and echo what I think two or three people have said here, which is, you know, I'm all in favor of a all-encompassing solution where we take biomass and efficiently convert it to hydrogen in a non-carbon or negative carbon way. And I look forward to the days 10 to 15 years from now when that sort of thing has commercial reality and viability. But from the perspective of a watershed management entity that is faced with wildfire reduction, fuels reduction right now today, the challenges of the logistics of the management and fuel reduction, trying to source a secure supply of fuels, the capital permitting and construction and operation risk of a biomass facility, even something as simple as biomass to energy. And then to add on top of that, both carbon capture and hydrogen production, which are both frankly very nascent technologies with insecure markets, unknown disposition of products, and certainly unknown pricing associated with those products. It's just too much for an entity to bite into. We may need to think about breaking this problem into pieces and or seeking that government support for some very distinct components. For example, if there was a state-sponsored program that would buy all the biochar and hydrogen we can produce at a known price, that would remove all of those sort of product risks from the backside and leave us with just the biomass fuel and facility siting and operation risks, which are formidable enough. Flip side, if the state or some sort of an entity wanted to provide the biomass clearing and fuel supply and leave us to dispose of the products in a way that made sense, maybe that's it. But to sort of look to a single entity and developer to do top to bottom, soup to nuts, I think is a bridge too far, and it's going to scare a lot of us to looking at simple biomass to energy type projects, or sticking with burning stuff in the forest, which is what we've been stuck with doing today. Thanks for that.
Sure. Okay, I saw a question just come in a couple minutes ago from Brian. I'm going to read it, or might be a comment. So I'm just reading it now. Since the language of the legislation funding the project says carbon negative fuels, does that mean sequestration of the liquid fuel, i.e. via injection into wells or being made into asphalt, is not eligible? Sequestration of the fuel would enable rapid conversion of huge volumes of biomass and avoid the complexity emissions associated with the fuel delivery infrastructure.
It's just a clarifying question, Brian. Are you referring to if a liquid is produced, does it have to be used? And if not, could we store it and not use it in markets?
Let's see. I think I need to, not everyone can just talk. Let me find you to have you come off. Brian. Here we are. Oh. There we go. Brian, I think you should be able to come off.
And Sarah, this is Elizabeth. I think I'm in a more stable place, and I'm happy to take a stab at that if Brian's not able to unmute.
Well, why don't you go ahead, and then if he can't come off, he might not have mic ability. So why don't you go ahead, Elizabeth?
Okay, thanks for the question, Brian. So the language in the SB 155 legislation says that all eligible projects shall identify a California use of the hydrogen or liquid fuel to be created. So it doesn't say it has to be used as a fuel, just that there is a use in California. That may bring up more questions than it answers, but that's the language we're dealing with. So would appreciate more information or insight from you on what you would recommend our interpretation of that being. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. So I'm wondering if everyone can see some of these questions, panelists, if you all see some of the questions in the chat. Would carbon bound up in chemical and material products be considered stored? If chemical co-products are made, would the replaced emissions compared to conventional sources be considered? Good question.
Yeah, I think that's an open question right now. I know at the federal level, the federal carbon capture credit does allow for utilization and a quantification of the avoided emissions. But that's still an open question for this program, and would appreciate any comments.
Elizabeth, I wonder if you want to do one other plug for getting input during this meeting, and or if folks need to think about it, them writing in and sharing with you.
Yeah, sure, Sarah. Thank you. And apologies for my in and out. Just really bad internet today, of course. So yeah, we would love your comments right now, of course, in the workshop, but we would also love them in written form, or if you would like to set up a conversation with us, happy to do that as well. They are most useful to us in the next 2 weeks as we really dig into developing the solicitation. So if you could get them to us by the end of the third week in April, that would be most useful. I'm not giving you a formal deadline because this isn't necessarily a formal or conventional process of receiving input for solicitation development, but we will use the opinions, information, recommendations that you give us today and in the next few weeks to develop the solicitation. And we will make the solicitation available in a public draft form for a month, for 30 days, probably mid-June to July time period. And so you will have another chance to give us formal comments, and that will be a much more formal structure. So again, if you have comments now, suggestions, recommendations, please get them to us in the next 2 weeks. I'll put my email in the chat again for that. And you will have another opportunity to give comments and recommendations and edits on an actual public draft mid-year.
Great. All right, we've had something else come into the Q&A, and then I'll check and see if other folks have something to add, and then otherwise we'll be moving to our last speaker, my colleague Moy. All right, I am new to this area and may be missing the bigger picture, but my understanding is that most of the forest residues are deep in the forest and very difficult to reach and move to places where they can be processed. All this discussion is very promising, but how would forest residues management be addressed?
Yeah, we're hoping to piggyback off of some of the work that has been done up to this point. At the beginning of the webinar, we heard from some of the work from OPR and GoBiz. But I think separately from that, one of the reasons we're approaching it from we're thinking about a two-phase process is to encourage some of the more feasibility work and connection making that may not otherwise be done. And so I would appreciate your feedback on the phasing approach and how much and what objectives should be targeted for each of those phases, if applicable.
Okay, and then this also just came in. Is CARB looking to possibly adopt this LCA under the LCFS? If so, does that affect the LCA parameters being discussed?
Sure, I can probably address that a little bit. Oh, the question disappeared. I like to look at it when I respond. So I think the two programs are not necessarily linked, right? I think that there is certainly potential for, CARB to be informed by this process, by the projects that are being considered and the LCAs that are, submitted under this solicitation. But there's no, requirement that they align. And I think there's, a difference in how the results of the LCA are used in each program, right? Under LCFS, it's a value, the value of credits generated for the use of each gallon or gallon equivalent of fuel. And under this program, it's more of a threshold, right? The project needs to be carbon negative. And so that's one of the performance metrics that would be used to evaluate projects. So, but yeah, I think, more generally, in a less formal way, the input and the learning from the experience of project proponents through this program is certainly valuable for LCFS. I think, as someone mentioned in the chat, there aren't operational projects, and it is really challenging to nail down prescriptive methodologies or adopt simplified calculators under, our regulatory programs when we don't have a lot of experience with the technology, the supply chain, all of the logistics, and other impacts and considerations. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. A quick question to everybody. We had planned to take another 5-minute break, which we totally can do, or we can just keep going to our next speaker. Can you all use the chat and tell me what your preference is? Keep going or break? Let's see what you think. Go. Okay, go ahead. All right, so Moy, my colleague Moy, you are going to be up. Let's see here. Let me see if I can pull this up for you. All righty.
Buenas tardes. Good afternoon,
There we go.
everyone.
Okay. We can hear you and see you. You look great.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes a todos. My name is Moises Moreno Rivera, and I humbly serve as the California Natural Resources Agency's Assistant Secretary for Equity and Environmental Justice. I am here today to guide us in a portion of the agenda titled Community Interests, Local Partnerships, and Environmental Justice, in which we're requesting your feedback and input via a set of questions that will facilitate this process. For level setting, and to bring those on board not familiar with environmental justice, EJ is defining government code, and it means a fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all peoples, all races, cultures, incomes, and national origins with respect to development, adoption, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. With that being said, projects funded under this program are expected to be fully supported by you all, especially the communities that will host them, sponsored by project proponents, local governments, tribes, and community advocates. While the program is not closed to any particular stakeholders or industries, community support and participation in the proposed project is mandatory, and community leadership is encouraged. Forums like this are helpful to receive your feedback, know who is all involved, and where we can find further information. Before we go into the questions portion, I want to thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest. And if there are colleagues and entities not represented today, please relay this information to them. To be effective in this pilot, we want to be inclusive, and I encourage you to help us achieve this goal. With that being said, let us get started with the Q&A portion. My colleagues here will take notes and provide a response in real time. Some of the questions posed under this section really get into what we're seeking. And if there's any questions on here, or you have any comments that are not addressed in these questions, please bring that up to our attention. We really welcome your input in this process. So the first question goes to, states, what does success look like for meeting community interests and public health priorities? Are there prior programs that are model examples? You know, in your current work and related work, or if you know of anything, it would be helpful to get this type of feedback. Know that there is another forum that will be catered to California tribal nations, and we welcome the strong participation of California Native American tribes through this program. Please share any information on existing tribal activities or interests relevant to this program. These questions are posted online, and thank you for Elizabeth for sharing that via the chat. How should we maximize outreach and community feedback for each project? What best practices will help ensure these projects are part of or create economic development opportunities for the communities in which they're located? I know when we do extensive outreach, one of the first things that we get asked is, how is this regional based? How is this maximizing benefits to the local communities? And your feedback on this is extremely important. Then what kind of assurances should be in place to make the most out of the public safety benefits that could be achieved for these projects? I could continue on, but I welcome you all to start this conversation, and really, if you have any questions or comments based on the questions that are posed and are online, please share your feedback with us.
I've just pasted in a couple of them. They didn't paste in that pretty, but in case it helps folks. Let's see, anyone want to use the raise hand? Oh, there we go. We got one. Let's see. Just 1 second. Oh, here it is. Christiana. I hope I'm saying your name correctly.
Hi, yeah, this is Christiana Darlington. I'm with Placer Air District, and I also work with Northern Sonoma and Mendocino Air Districts, which are both in rural areas in California. I just wanted to mention that there's a great section about equity and biofuels in the report that Dan Sanchez just put out with his partner Harris. Hopefully you could check that out. I think there's some really interesting things that Teal put together in her section on this issue. And I really wanted to emphasize that there really are two tracks here, right? Like Dan mentioned earlier, there's the community scale projects and what that really looks like in rural areas where transportation's a big problem for getting the products out, but really close to the feedstock. And then vice versa, there are these issues with, being in more populated areas where it's easier to distribute the product, but harder to get the feedstock. So while you try to balance those issues, I think working with the local communities to see that their emphasis is on one side or the other, will help kind of bring them to the projects and then bring an understanding, but also I think it has to be realistically approached that we need both large and small scale projects in this space. And some of them are going to complement rural economies and rural people more. And the other are going to, complement some, more urban communities of color. And that can be done. It just has to be done consciously. That's my input. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And again, if you have links that you could share, as you mentioned, Dan was, they're already putting in the comment section. If you could share those links, or if anyone has that available, we welcome that, especially right now as folks are requesting it. So thank you. Sarah, are there any other questions?
Here comes Julia. Go for it, Julia.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Christiana's point and zero in on a related issue, which is the state's definition of disadvantaged communities is heavily weighted toward population density. And unfortunately, that leaves out most or all of the forested regions of the state. And so I think a lot of those communities would otherwise meet the definition. They're incredibly polluted in some cases, particularly from wildfire smoke and other issues. And many of them are very, very low income and suffer high levels of unemployment, poverty, et cetera. And so I think the community outreach with a forest biofuels project is going to have to look a little bit different than community outreach in a more urbanized area. And it's challenging, but I think this is an area where the broader definition of environmental justice needs to go beyond the state's limited focus on disadvantaged communities that are highly populated areas. I don't know exactly how to do that, but I just wanted to point that out because I think we leave a lot of the state behind in the current definition of disadvantaged communities, and particularly the rural areas that are most impacted by wildfire and that would benefit the most from converting forest waste to energy.
Thank you so much, Julia. And that's something that's been an ongoing conversation. I know in Cali PA's last iteration of the update for SB 535 and the update for Cal Enviro Screen, this is a feedback that we've been getting on behalf of the state. And just know that at our agency, we've started this conversation as to how do we broaden this scope and how are we more inclusive. So thank you for your comment. And again, this is something that's ongoing and we're trying to work towards.
Moy, I thought I would check in with some of the folks that we haven't heard from yet, just in case they want to add in. Let's see, Taylor, Seth, Robert, Richard, Preston. Anybody want to add in? Or Joseph, let's see here. Go ahead, Joseph.
Hi, Joe Desmond. I'm speaking today here on behalf of Carbon America, which is a carbon capture sequestration developer based in Colorado, but obviously focused on many areas. I want to go back to some of the issues that people have been talking about, because I think this really comes down to what are the objectives of this pilot, and what can a pilot realistically accomplish. You heard from Bob Hambrecht, who was talking about looking at the project through the eyes of saying, as a business, you have to think about all the opportunities to capture benefit and value, and that includes stacking with LCFS. But I think, you know, as you might expect, all of the issues that would come with a pathway and the amount of time and the compliance with that pathway, you know, is not going to fit within the timeframe of the project. So I go back to what lessons could we have, and looking at some of the language here that had been put forth. But I just want to give you the example, and I'm not recommending this project in particular, but in the UK, Drax Power is operating 2 pilot bioenergy with carbon capture facilities. No connection, no relation whatsoever to what the company I'm representing here. And they have plans for commercial scale in 2027. But the existing plant that they have provides about 6% of the country's electrical supply. And they've converted coal to renewable fuels and things like for the power generation. But I just want to mention that the first pilot CO2 capture facility with Bacchus started operating in 2019 using capture technology, and it had the capacity to capture 1 ton of CO2 per day. The second pilot, which started up in 2020 using technology, I want to say from Mitsubishi, capturing around 300 kilograms of CO2 per day to test the technology with biomass flue gas. And so as I thought about that, this to me, if you're looking to do demonstrations, I know it may not necessarily be the community scale on a pilot initially, but you have to go through that de-risking on any of these things. And I thought if you could look at, maybe it's a combination of those two right there, where you're demonstrating the ability to actually capture with the forest biomass and do it in a repeated fashion. But at the same time, looking at what a set of life cycle analysis calculations might be under different scenarios. For instance, am I transporting the biomass via a diesel tractor? Am I looking at new efficient hydrogen vehicles that have been fueled? And so this way you can at least come away with some conclusions, perhaps indicating what elements at a scaled project would have the most benefit, giving some cost analysis. So anyway, I just wanted to say, you want these projects to work. I clearly there's some initial challenges, but maybe that's the first stage of what you could do. But I just wanted to suggest that that's how it's being done elsewhere, and it might be able to fit here. Oh, the thing I wanted to say is they released, I forgot to mention this, with those captured, the project is releasing the small amount of quantities from CO2 from the pilot, and that was intentional because they wanted to demonstrate at scale without having to put a tremendous investment until they were sure it was going to work.
Thank you. Noah, you ready? Want to come on?
Yes,
in?
thank you.
Sure.
Great. This is Noah Jackson, Yosemite Clean Energy. Appreciate you coming on with this. And just want to touch briefly on the tribal aspect. I know you guys are having a separate RFI this week to address tribal interests. We've had, great conversations in a couple of our project areas with tribes, and they have a lot of value to add and want to participate in the project. One grant or one issue we've run into in the past in applying for grants is that was only considered if it was a tribally owned business. And I think this may have been more on the federal level, but to be majority owned, by a tribal entity, not a lot of tribes in the areas we're working with, or I should say none, can come up with $20+ million to put up a majority of the capital necessary to do a large scale gasification project. So I would just suggest that tribal participation and other minority group participation be considered, even if it's not simply a tribally owned company, etc.
Thank you so much, Noah. And we, aside from the workshop, right? And aside from the workshop, we always welcome this style of feedback and this type of feedback. I know our Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs, Geneva E.B. Thompson, is working with a number of our departments, including the Department of Conservation, to find ways how we can improve and our engagement and our partnerships with tribal nations. So, if this is not brought up at this other forum, I welcome that feedback, and for us, for you to be able to also reach out to Geneva.
Sounds good. Thank you, Moises.
Thank you. Okay, checking in with some others. I'm just looking at my list. Shayla, Robert, Nelson, Nathan, Miles, Matthew. Anybody else want to add in or comment? Kevin, Katie, John, Joe, Jim, Jeff. Anyone else? Oh, there we go. Okay, I got some hands. Hold on 1 second. Let me get you. There we go. Okay, Robert, and then Preston.
Unmute. There we go. Unmuted. I'm unmuted now, right?
Okay, go for it, Robert.
Okay. So I'm probably going to reiterate a couple comments or take a slight, tangent on what a couple people said. I think Christiana and Julia's comment. By the way, it's Bob Hambrecht at Allotrope Partners. I know it comes across as Robert, but I think Christiana and Julia really talked about sort of this scale versus community engagement issue that is a real challenge with certain technologies. I think we've been trying to work with our technology provider to bring the size of our projects down as much as we can to a small enough size that they would work, in a forest community, say at Quincy. We're at the point where we think it really needs to be in an Orville or a Reading, a slightly bigger community that would be okay with 400,000 bone dry tons arriving, over the course of the year, and the amount of traffic and the amount of impact that has. And I think there's a real balance that needs to be struck, and not an easy question. And the other point I wanted to make is, so this comes to that kind of question of phasing the financing and the technology readiness levels. I believe if the Department of Conservation determines that, hey, we want to do stuff that's, past pilot and ready for scale, then the type of capital that is really needed is what we'd call project development capital. The capital to do the detail engineering that allows you to get to a point where your financiers will say, okay, you have an engineer that's designed this thing down to every bolt and every weld, and we know what the cost is. And we have a technology partner willing to guarantee it. And there's a lot of money needed at that stage to do the engineering stages to get you to the point where you're financeable. If in fact, as Joe suggested, you want to do things that are more like pilots, then I think it's a different type of capital where you're funding a portion of the actual project, making the cost of that pilot overall more affordable to, say, the private capital that's going to support it. So I guess depending on what TRL level you decide, I think you should think differently about how you utilize the capital. And I'll leave it at that. I'll probably write this up and send this to you, Elizabeth, as well, but I thought I'd bring that up here.
Thank you, Robert. Super helpful. Okay, Preston, you're up. We can hear you.
Thanks. Thank you. Just a little context. I'm a research geologist from Lawrence Berkeley Lab, working on geologic carbon sequestration. So I'm a little outside my zone here, but happy to be here. I guess I'm sort of struggling with scale and time because of my involvement of developing geologic carbon sequestration projects. I mean, it's like one I'm involved with. We're over 3 years in, and it's just about to submit its permit application. I know another project that has submitted in California is submitted its application over 2 years ago. This is application for injection. So I don't know if you don't go with biochar if you're going to go with geologic carbon sequestration. It's hard for me to see how any project on the timeline, as I understand it, for this $50 million pot of money to use forest products with negative carbon intensity are going to be able to get there. But more to the current topic, there's a couple of projects in California. Clean Energy Systems has announced a project in the town of Mendota, which in community relations is not my area of knowledge in this, but my understanding is it's been well received so far. And San Joaquin Renewables, and that's a biomass to power oxy fuel or oxy combustion project. San Joaquin Renewables to the west of McFarland, I believe, has announced a project, or at least it has a permit that's been injection permit application that's been submitted. That is a biomass to RNG. And relative to what a prior commenter said, both those projects are on the 1,000 ton per day CO2 capture size. At least that's what they're engineering to. You know, it remains to be seen what actually happens in the end. They hit their capacity factor. But so I think those might be a couple points. Those might be interesting test cases in terms of, you know, how's community outreach gone there. What does that look like so far? Both of them, to my understanding, are going to run on agricultural biomass. And so, again, from what little I know, it seems like there is a pretty strong developing market because of LCFS. I don't know how that will intersect. I mean, that'll work for the RNG project for San Joaquin Renewables. The Mendota project, I presume this wouldn't be eligible for because it's going to produce a syngas from the biomass, which obviously will have some hydrogen in it, which will then combust, but also carbon monoxide, which is not inbound, I think, for this particular program. But given these larger utilization facilities that are in the offing, it seems like a major challenge is getting biomass to them. More biomass to them. I know in the McFarland area, there's an existing converted coal-fired power plant that runs on biomass, and it's currently using agricultural biomass. So they may get into a position of competing with each other and sort of reduce capacity because there isn't enough agricultural biomass within the shed. So I'm just putting a lot of stuff on the table. I don't know what the solution is in terms of forest biomass, how to match where it is to where it could be utilized. Bunch of random thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Preston, and I appreciate your feedback. I do want to get us back to the conversation on environmental justice and you know the impacts for communities. And I know that there was brought up the conversation on disadvantaged communities was brought up, and I know Elizabeth had a question or a follow-up to that initial conversation we were having on this topic. Elizabeth, do you want to ask your question or the follow-up, to continue this, this framing for the impacts on communities?
Thanks so much, Moises. Yeah, so we are, of course, meeting with the tribes, interested tribes on Thursday, but I am wondering, being that Noah brought up the fact of tribes being involved and some of the limitations that might be out there and opportunities, we are looking at the options of shaping the solicitation in terms of requiring the involvement of disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities, and or tribes versus the sort of like extra points, like bonus points in proposal review. And so I'm wondering, Moises, if you have thoughts about that, and then certainly would love to hear from participants as to the requirement versus bonus consideration in the scoring process. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really great question. For me, when I think about the state's, or at least our agency's commitment to addressing historical wrongs and our agency's commitment to working with underserved populations, making it a concerted effort to engage directly with underserved populations, including environmental justice communities and tribal nations and tribal communities from the get-go, rather than having this be an add-on. It aligns more with what we're trying to get at, right? If we're doing this from the beginning and we're being intentional since the beginning, it will not only incentivize other programs that we're working on to also do this, right? Now, to the other point of getting extra points, when we're thinking about communities that have been, in many ways, whether implicitly or explicitly, underserved, we need to be able to then say, what can the state do, and that's intentional. And this is one of those aspects, in my opinion. And I commend, the Department of Conservation to be able to do this in a way that's intentional. And I encourage other, comments from the public at this point. Does that answer your question, Elizabeth?
Yeah, no, that's super helpful for me. And I really would like to hear from participants here, because some of the feedback we've gotten, I've asked this question of a couple of potential project proponents, and they have concerns about, existing capacity. Like if we require it, if it's a pass fail, and they can't find a tribe to be involved. These are such big projects that I would hope that there are enough opportunities out there that you would be able to find a good way to partner, an effective way to partner. But we were talking about local communities being involved, and in so many places throughout the Sierra, local communities are incredibly under-resourced. And so, requiring that kind of partnership may actually put project proponents at a disadvantage. And so I absolutely appreciate the thought behind requiring it. And I wonder if there are ways that we can, options that we can propose that would not disadvantage groups that are wanting to serve some of the least capacity regions of the Sierra Nevada.
Yeah, those are valid points, Elizabeth. And really thinking about it, I know Noah had a comment, and I saw his hand raised. When we're thinking of, thinking about this, how do we do this in a way that's not cookie cutter approach? That it does not, we've already had conversations that we need to expand on community capacity building and technical assistance, right? So how do we prioritize communities without exacerbating or providing those necessary resources? But Noah.
Oh, and also Katie had her hand up. If we want to go to Katie first, then Noah.
Noah had his hand first and dropped it down.
Oh, he did? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go for it. Thanks, Moy.
Sorry about that. Thanks for catching that. Yeah, I mean, my one caution, as was mentioned earlier, is, just not boxing it in so strictly to where here's a perfect location and a perfect project, and then, there's just not the right entity to that gets on board to where now there's no benefit for the community. So I guess I would, if the at-risk community is defined broadly enough, then that's just my one encouragement would be, if communities at, extreme risk of wildfire was one of the qualifications, or I think it would be, for example, to require something as narrow as having to have tribal involvement, that boxes in a lot of projects, and that basically automatically disqualifies them, even though they're adding so many benefits to the community that they're in. So in us having projects in multiple locations all over the state, there's we're seeing kind of different locations that would be ideal for projects, but because maybe they're a little bit farther from, for example, like the center of a tribal nation, it's harder to get their involvement. So I would say as long as it's defined broadly enough, but that's my one addition.
Thank you, Noah, for that. Katie.
Yeah, hi, Katie Harrell here with the Joint Institute. My comments are similar to Noah's. I would be concerned that if you put too many expectations out of the gate, you're going to minimize the number of people that can participate. And maybe the way to still ensure capturing the high risk group or the underserved community representation, maybe we add something in there that says, in the early stages after this gets going, there's a community engagement requirement that has to happen, or tribal engagement requirement that has to happen depending upon where the project is. So that it becomes a part of the program rather than an expectation to apply for the program.
Thank you, Katie. Sarah, do we have other questions?
Not yet. Don't see anyone else at the moment. We'd love to hear from more of you all, even if it's to say, yes, I agree with that, or I disagree. Okay. So I'll give you one more moment to see if you want to add in and make any kind of comment. And then we're going to begin to wrap up our session. So Moy, I imagine we could be pulling back on you, but let me just also in the meantime say thank you so much. We're so grateful to have you.
Well, thank you all. And again, thank you for those that have taken your time to be with us today. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Elizabeth, do you want to help us start to wrap up?
Yeah, I can help with that. I just want to add my thanks to Sarah's and Moises's thank you, and the gratitude to our section leads. I did not want to be the one talking this whole time, and it's a good thing I wasn't. So I was in and out so much. And so I just am really grateful to our agency partners in helping us move through this agenda today. I want to encourage you, please, to submit comments if you still have them. We would love to get your comments in writing. We have recorded this. It will be available on our website, on the project webpage, hopefully within the next week or so, and we will be taking notes off of it. I've already gotten a ton of great input to help in guiding us as we move forward with the solicitation, but anything more you have, very, very much welcome. If you would like to have a conversation with the Department of Conservation, with or one of our partner agencies who presented today, we're happy to arrange that. We just want all the input we can possibly get to make this a really successful project. It is a pretty interesting opportunity for our state, and especially for the Sierra Nevada specifically. Forest biofuels development is a pretty new frontier, and we're really excited to be part of moving this forward. So,
Elizabeth, we have had one hand come up from Noah.
Oh, sure.
All right, go ahead, Noah.
Okay, thanks. Hey, I am sorry I didn't find a time to ask this question specifically. I think I guess may have been more appropriate at the beginning during timeline, but the two-phase scope was raised. I love the idea of the two-phase. I think it's helpful. My only concern is it actually may slow the timeline of certain projects that are ready for phase 2 funding now. And so I can draft that as well, Elizabeth, but that would be, there's no reason to slow a project if it's got kind of the checklist that we're looking for in phase 1 already through the gate. So that's all.
Thank you, Noah. I totally agree with you. And what we're hoping, and if you have comments on this, you and really anyone, we would love for suggestions on what has to be completed or accomplished in phase one to be eligible for a phase one award, and then what needs to be completed in that time period to be eligible for a phase two award. I don't think that we'll go straight to phase two for anyone, just because that would be inequitable in comparing applications. However, if we receive a phase one application that has, accomplished everything that we have in the solicitation scoring criteria for phase two, perhaps that project proponent could request phase one funding to move their environmental permitting along, for example, or their LCA. Something that has to happen anyway, and that, $50,000 in 6 months would be a good use of time or use of money for that. That kind of input as to what these different phases should look like will be very helpful. We would like to maintain the two-phase approach to make sure that smaller scale community-driven projects are on the same footing as the larger private, industry-driven projects, just to make sure that we are serving all of the project proponents out there in the diversity of places that they're at with development.
Hey, Elizabeth, I just noticed in the Q&A function, we have one other, did I hear it correctly, that projects utilizing geologic carbon capture and sequestration are not eligible?
I'm glad you asked that question. We absolutely consider those projects eligible. So, and in fact, that seems like a technology progression for our state that this funding opportunity presents incentive for as far as moving that forward. So no, if you have a project where you're considering CCS or even direct air capture as part of getting a lower carbon intensity score, that is something that we are happy to entertain, at least as far as our thoughts on what the solicitation will look like at this point.
Right. Well, before I let you say the final goodbye, Elizabeth, I just want to do my own personal thank you to everyone who's coming. This has been an absolute pleasure. And Rosaldo, Moy, Mike, Justin, Anthi, and we lost, Tim had to go, but in Tim, it's really, I'm grateful to be in the company of such fantastic folks. So Elizabeth, you want to say our final thank you and adios?
This is like a Bach ending. Yeah, I think we're done. Gratitude to all of you. We're looking forward to talking with you more as time moves on and receiving your comments. Thanks for participating today.